All right, so let's rock this, dude.
Yeah.
Welcome to Sailors in Suits, the show with good looks and even better sailors. Today I'm so stoked to have a good friend and a total badass, Brad Milliken, with us. Brad was a sailor and a cadet at the Coast Guard Academy and graduated in 2014. And then he was an officer in the Coast Guard until 2019. His first job with the Coast Guard was as the Assistant Operations Officer on the Coast Guard cutter Vigorous, based out of Virginia Beach, Virginia, where he focused on migrant interdiction in the Florida Straits and drug interdiction in the Southern Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. After Coast Guard cutter Vigorous, he was a command duty officer at Coast Guard Sector Hampton Roads, which is now Sector Virginia. There, his main focus was search and rescue and emergency management. That led him into what he does now. Brad is a disaster response team leader for the Pacific Disaster Center. All the while, Brad has maintained a presence on the racing scene, sailboat racing scene, with his wife, Marissa. So, Brad, we've got a lot to cover, dude. How are you doing?
No, I'm good. This is awesome. Thanks for having me. It's great to catch up. Yeah, really excited about what you guys have going on.
Dude, super stoked about this. So, Brad and I definitely crossed paths in youth sailing, where we were the same age in school. But when we first really got to know each other is at the Coast Guard Academy. I only was there for about a year and a half. You saw it through. But we went through boot camp together, Brad, in Gulf Company. What comes to mind when we talk about boot camp, man? That was 10 years ago at this point.
Yeah, that's nuts. It definitely feels like it was not 10 years ago. For me, it was all about trying to fly under the radar and not be noticed. I think I was like, in good enough shape to not be one of the people that got picked on. And I was decent enough at memorizing things that I was never the guy that didn't know anything. So for me, it was definitely like, don't be first, don't be last, try to keep my head down.
The antithesis of our good friend Parker Simon.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, dude, a lot of lessons from boot camp. So we could talk about that forever. I don't know how much of it is appropriate. Anyway, so you do 4 years at the Coast Guard Academy. Very different college experience. We could do a whole interview about that in college sailing. But there's so much to talk about since your graduation. When you left the Coast Guard Academy, you leave as a commissioned officer as an ensign, and you went and your first posting was on the Coast Guard cutter Vigorous. I know a bit about what it's like from my summer experiences, but a lot of our viewers have no idea what it's like to be an officer with all that responsibility at that age. How old were you when you graduated?
22.
Yeah, that's wild. So tell us all about what it was like getting acclimated and taking your role on the Vigorous.
Sure. So Coast Guard Cutter Vigorous is a medium endurance cutter for the Coast Guard. So it's 210 feet long. It has a crew of between 70 and 80. For our deployments, we would go either to the Southern Caribbean, the Florida Straits, or we would go through the Panama Canal and do drug interdiction in the Eastern Pacific. My role as the Assistant Operations Officer, I was in charge of everything kind of from the bridge up. So everything about the navigation, all the communications, and occasionally some of our law enforcement type stuff, anything that was happening kind of at the brain of the boat. Not saying that I was the one making those decisions or anything, but all of the people who made all that stuff happen, I was working alongside it.
So with that role on the boat, Brad, is going through the Panama Canal a cool thing or a total pain in the ass if you're the one who has to do all the logistics and operations?
It's very much both at the same time. I think, all the prep work leading up to it is kind of nuts. And the pilots for the Panama Canal use a system of measurement that I don't think anyone else in the world uses. They measure distance and cables. They measure like degrees and stuff and points. So we showed up with all of our charts ready to go with, all of our measurements to do everything real quick. And they're like, okay, you need this many cables from that. What the hell is a cable?
Yeah.
But so the first time going through, it was kind of a scramble, and really kind of frustrating, just the amount of prep work. I don't think I prepped for a single transit. That was far and above the most prep work I had to do. But like actually getting to drive through the canal, especially for the first time, was super cool.
How many times have you been through it?
3.
Nice.
I guess, yeah, 3.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got picked up on the Pacific side once, but yeah.
That's crazy. So what kind of stuff what give us some examples of things that you were doing once you made it to the Pacific or when you were down in the Florida Straits? Like, give us some law enforcement drug interdiction examples, just so people kind of know what that means more and what your role was.
So while Coast Guard Cutter Vigorous was in the Florida Straits, we were one of the only major Coast Guard units in that part of the world when, at that time, the Obama administration announced that they wanted to normalize relations with Cuba, and that triggered a massive migration. There was a bunch of folks there's a policy, the wet foot, dry foot policy. A bunch of folks from Cuba kind of saw their window closing. So a large group of people who, were on the fence about trying to make the transit from Cuba to Florida. A lot of them said, hey, this is it, we're going. And a lot of them kind of took to the Florida Straits in vessels that weren't vessels. There were a lot of people in kind of like makeshift boats, makeshift rafts. And, one of the purposes of what we were doing was certainly, border protection, migrant interdiction. But a lot of what we were doing was search and rescue, because people were kind of in over their heads, and
they're purposely, under the radar, and you're trying to look out for them.
Yeah.
Coming in.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And then on the drug interdiction side, the game is kind of different for the Caribbean side and the Pacific side. If you've ever seen the videos of like the semi-submersibles and the super go fast, that's all primarily what's happening on the Pacific side.
Okay.
That's like a go chase them, launch the helicopter will shoot the engines out. It's
warning
cool.
shots.
Yeah. And it's super exciting, except for when it isn't, because there's either nothing happening or everything's happening all at once. On the Caribbean side, it's much more people trying to be sneaky and people trying to blend in and smuggle whatever they're smuggling in like a hidden compartment of a container ship or something that has a legitimate purpose. So
they're sneakier down in Florida, and in the Pacific they're just going big.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. So that's some pretty crazy stuff. So when you left Vigorous, you made a relatively, you were still doing similar stuff, and you moved more into search and rescue when you got to Coast Guard Sector Hampton Roads, now Sector Virginia.
Yep. Yeah.
But now you're based on shore, doing a lot more
Correct.
Management, planning. So what was that shift like? What did you like about it? And then how did your role develop, and what were you doing once you were at the sector?
Sure. So first and foremost, I wanted to get into search and rescue. I think that was a big reason of why I even wanted to be in the Coast Guard in the first place. And there's nowhere that's more hands-on search and rescue than the command duty officer position at the sector. They're the ones that move all the chess pieces on the board. At the sector, we would get the calls from folks on the radio, and then we were tapped into all of the local 911 call centers. So anytime anyone in Virginia called 911 about anything that happened on the water, the move was they would forward that call to us, and we would handle it. So it was.
So you're having to filter. You're having to filter a lot of information when you get. If you're hooked up to all those calls.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And the shift from the ship to that role was easier than I thought it would be. My role on the ship, I was never like the guy on the small boat or the boarding officer. I was usually the one on the ship moving the chess pieces on the board in CIC, our Combat Information Center, mostly communications. And I got really comfortable on the ship with my domain being information management. And that's really all that search and rescue coordination is. Trying to find out what you know, trying to find out what you don't know, and make a game plan to move forward.
So Brad, you and I have spoken, and then over years past, about as you've kind of evolved into this search and rescue expert, I think it's safe to say. There have been a lot of situations you've told me about where you're growing up sailing and growing up as a waterman outside of being in the Coast Guard has helped you just kind of make sense of situations. You've said something to me before that they told you at search and rescue school, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're trying to make decisions based on 100% consequence with 50% of the information that you need, or something like that. And then so talk to us about, how your experience outside of Coast Guard on the water and sailing has helped you mitigate that difference when you're making these big decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you nailed it. You in search and rescue, you have to make decisions with 100% consequence based off 50% of the information you'd like. And that's usually, somebody driving over a bridge and saying, I saw a boat, I think they need help. Like, okay, well, here are all of the rest of the information I need. And they're saying, well, I didn't get that. I'm driving 70 miles an hour and I don't see him anymore. So trying to take whatever you're given, knowing it might be incomplete, and filling in the remaining gaps. And yeah, understanding sailing made me, more capable at filling some of those gaps. I understood tide cycles. I understood, how our drifts work. The Coast Guard has a system where we define an area where someone might have been, and we play a bunch of like real-time environmental data, and it creates a bunch of drifts and runs a bunch of scenarios, and it recommends a search pattern. For people who don't really have the understanding of, how water moves and how wind can push things on the surface, they kind of have to believe the system because they don't have anything else. And there's one scenario, for example, where kind of up in the James River, which is off the Chesapeake Bay, it's a big curvy river. And the way that the system moves water through that river, it just moves everything uniformly around all of the bends. But I grew up sailing in Charleston, and that's
it's not how it works, right?
So kind of going through and saying like, hey, at each one of these, like almost 90-degree bends, there's going to be eddies that our system isn't accounting for. And so in this particular scenario, we'd gotten a call about a guy that had fallen overboard on a sailboat, and our model just shot him down the river. And having that knowledge to say, no, like, I think these eddies are going to be a factor. We need to check kind of these spots where I think eddies might be. And we ended up shifting our search area, back up the river, and we were able to find the guy, which was awesome. But I think I got an appreciation for how water moves after, trying to adapt to it on the race course. And that was certainly super valuable.
Yeah, man, that's such a good plug for youth sailing, but it's such a real example. So, Brad, it's going to be hard for me to keep this short because I think everything's so interesting. But so we're going to move on to our rapid fire segments.
Yeah.
This is where hopefully we're going to learn a little bit more about you. Sure. Our first question is always cats or dogs, but I'm pretty sure you're going to answer dogs. And you've got a dog named Ollie, right?
Yeah. We got two dogs, Ollie and Jetty.
Oh, I didn't know about the second dog. How are they doing? Are they loving all this time you get to spend with them?
Yeah. They're all about it.
Right. Sorry, I keep forgetting this rapid fire questions.
Yeah, okay.
I'm trying to catch up with you, man. All right. So, Brad, if you had to choose between a single seat bicycle and a double seat bicycle, which would you choose?
Tandem bicycle, for sure.
Tandem bicycle, the proper verbiage.
Just saying about a tandem bicycle fast forwards a relationship in the direction it's already going. And
that's awesome. We're gonna put a bunch of pictures in over here or something. All right. So your favorite, if you had to go somewhere for a month to vacation and just chill, where would you
go? Probably the Bahamas.
Nice. We're going to get more into that soon. Favorite place to sail?
Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina.
Nice. Good breeze out there, huh? What was your favorite youth regatta to attend when you were in youth sailing?
Ooh, favorite youth regatta? Orange Bowl. Definitely Orange Bowl.
That's a pretty easy one to say. Yeah. I agree. So you have a thistle, I think, named SOB. What does that stand for?
Yeah, so it's Sean's old boat. One of the boats I grew up sailing on. There's a guy named Sean Murphy from our yacht club who took me sailing a bunch. Unfortunately, Sean passed away for cancer, and we were able to track down his old boat, the boat that I kind of grew up sailing on. We were able to have it, and we're making some repairs, but we'll get it back out there.
That's awesome. That's a different answer than I thought maybe, but I like that answer better. Well, so what's your favorite port to go to? Port call.
Ooh, hmm. Panama City and Panama is cool. And then Key West is a good time every time.
Yeah, I like that. Good time every time. Um, so what's your favorite place to surf?
Um, I I like Virginia Beach. It was home for 5 years, and kind of I don't know if I like surfing in Virginia Beach more than I liked being a local in Virginia Beach,
Yeah, there you
but
go.
yeah, that was the
So,
spot.
so leading into my next rapid fire question for you, making a better beach, the community
Yeah.
initiative that you and Marissa started to clean up your local beach, was that actually to have a cleaner beach, or did you just want ways to get yourself some free beer?
Yeah. So it started when I was playing frisbee with the dog Ollie on the beach, and he got a big shard of glass stuck in his paw. And honestly, I was just complaining about it to a friend of mine that worked at a bar, and he was saying like, "Yeah, if I knew that people cleaned up the beach, I'd probably give them a free beer." Had a similar conversation with a friend that worked at a coffee shop, and she said like, "Yeah, I'd give somebody that cleaned up the beach a free coffee." So really before we knew what we were getting into, we had like six businesses that had kind of committed to offering incentives for people who cleaned up the beach. And then it was really just kind of like pushing them over the edge to do it. And it
That's
was it
so,
was
that's
awesome.
so awesome, dude. I'd be cleaning up the beach all the time. Be like, oh, I need another
Yeah.
coffee. Let's hit the beach. Um, all right. So, what's it like being married to another competitive sailor that's debatably much better than you, and also when
Oh
your
man.
sister-in-law is an Olympian?
It's awesome. I think we're figuring out being in the boat together. We both like to drive. We both like to call the shots. But no, it's awesome. We've done a bunch of team racing, and I think the move for us is to be on the same team in different boats. But
Dude, I like that. When you can accomplish that, it's a win-win. Um, all right. So, when you go sailing or surfing by yourself, you give Marissa or somebody a float plan if she's in town. Can you tell us just
yeah,
briefly and quickly what a float plan is, when people should use it, and what it should include?
yeah, absolutely. So I've got a saved text in the notes of my phones for when I was going to surf alone, and it has where I'm going, where I parked my car, what time I'm going to be in the water, what time I plan to be out of the water, and then kind of most importantly, if you don't hear from me by X time, here's who you should call. And that came from a search and rescue case we had where there was a wife that reported her husband as missing, and she knew he went surfing, didn't know where he went, didn't know where he normally goes, didn't know what time he should have been back or what time he went surfing. So, at go, we were saying like, okay, so somewhere between Northern Virginia and the Southern Outer Banks, in the
Yeah,
past 18 hours, some guy went surfing. Okay,
that's a lot of coastline.
yeah, and for me, it was thinking that like, I hope no one ever has to come look for me, but if they did, I would feel so dumb if I didn't give them all of the information they needed. So in this text, if I'm missing and Marissa calls the number I gave her and reads that text, they have everything they need to get started looking for me. And it applies to sailing, surfing, climbing, hiking. It's a good idea.
Nice. And you know better than anybody what that information should include because you're the guy who goes out and looks for the people.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, right on. So, what are two things that you'd want if you were stranded on an island for an undetermined amount of time?
uh I like the first thing I thought of was like survival stuff. I need a knife and water purification, but I don't know, like maybe a book.
Nice. Yeah. Your ukulele?
Yeah.
You'd be chilling, dude. You'd love that. So, it may be hard for you to boil down into one, and being an officer in the Coast Guard, you're in a lot of scary situations that you may not actually be scared of because you have responsibility in them. But you've also done a lot of sailing and surfing and stuff on the water. Is there a scariest moment on the water that sticks out for you?
Ooh, scariest moment. Uh, there's a couple times surfing where I had a couple like hold downs that just like in the moment they only lasted like maybe 20 seconds, but those were like really terrifying. In terms of uh, scariest probably isn't the word, but last year there was a 3-2-1 regatta where I had the worst leeward mark rounding on a J22 with Ian Berman and Mary Baker. I was coming off the bow with a pole and I fell into the cockpit and like threw the pole back at Ian and Mary, and I was like pretty sure I killed one or both of them, and that was
Brad, that's crazy. So yesterday we were filming an interview with Katie Tinder, who works at Columbia Yacht Club Sailing School in the city, great friend of mine. I asked her in rapid fire questions, who is like somebody that you look up to the most in sailing? And she said Ian Berman. Was he the Navy coach?
Yeah, yep.
Or the Navy coach? So that's crazy. Yesterday we're talking to Katie, who said that Ian got her into lifelong sailing career. And then now we're talking to you, and you're telling us that you almost killed him accidentally.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Dude, it's such a small world.
Yeah, that's nice.
All right, so Brad, now we're going to get into a little bit. We're going to move into all the disaster response stuff, right? So if we look at your career from a really broad perspective, you know, we've got sailing all throughout, and then we've got the Coast Guard stuff, which developed into an expertise in search and rescue. All right. Then we had rapid fire questions, and now we're talking about what you do now. And so you are a disaster response team lead for Pacific Disaster Center. So can you tell us about Pacific Disaster Center as a whole, and then like the things you've responded to, and then maybe after that we'll talk about the big picture.
Sure. So the Pacific Disaster Center is an applied research center managed by the University of Hawaii. A lot of what we do is information management and data management for humanitarian data and disasters. So a lot of focus on getting the critical information that decision makers need, you know, from the field with the right context, you know, kind of in a way that they can digest during the disaster preparedness and disaster response.
So if you had to break down a percentage, you specifically as a disaster response team leader, how much of what you do is putting together ways to get the data out and all of the preparedness stuff versus the response to an actual disaster? I mean, obviously one implements the other, but how much is prep, and how often are you on the ground?
So we spend a lot of time in various countries working with their national disaster management organizations, so their FEMA equivalents. And these preparedness assessments that we do in these countries are really data driven, and I probably spend most of my time doing that. And a lot of that is, you know, making sure that we're getting all the risk and vulnerability and disaster management data, and we're kind of giving them a baseline of where they can improve in the preparedness space, so before anything happens. But all of that work and all of that data collection that I spend most of my time doing becomes relevant as soon as something has happened. And being able to, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Can you walk us through what we're talking about now? But can we use your involvement with Hurricane Dorian as an example?
Yeah. So we had been doing a disaster preparedness assessment with the government of the Bahamas. And as part of that assessment, I'd been on the ground in the Bahamas, collecting data and doing a bunch of interviews with folks. And on the island of Abaco, there's a large migrant population, a bunch of shanty towns that the government just didn't have any really like concrete information on.
Yeah.
So we'd been in the country for 6 months, not continually, but we'd been working with them for 6 months. And a lot of what I'd been focusing on was kind of these areas that ended up getting hit by Hurricane Dorian. So pre-landfall, I think we might have had maybe not more information, but maybe better information about some of those vulnerable communities than some of the government organizations, just because we've been spending the time doing it. So 4 or 5 days before Dorian made landfall, I got a call that said, "Hey, need you to go to the Bahamas like right now," and spent several weeks in the Bahamas.
So you were there. You were there for landfall.
Yeah. Yep. 100%. In their equivalent of FEMA is called NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, and I was working every day in their National Emergency Operations Center. Sometimes sleeping in the barracks room in the back, but the role that I was supporting was the emergency support function of information management and planning. So kind of very similar to what I was doing when I was a command duty officer at Sector Hampton Roads, getting the right problems in front of the right people, information traffic control, and kind of trying to be a calming presence on some of the mayhem, because whoever's controlling the information and meeting all the needs, they kind of set the tone for how everybody else approaches their job, because everybody needs information to make stuff happen.
That's so crazy. And I was just about to ask a question that now is kind of stupid, but like if you were on a big race boat, like TP52 series, Super Series or something, I was going to say like what your role in these situations, what would your, analog role be on one of these race boats? But I think you'd be that guy that, whether it's the tactician or what, who's getting all the information and telling everyone who needs it, like what our speed's like, what our relatives are like, what the wind's doing. Like, it sounds like that's you. Everything's kind of going through you, but you're taking all the data you've learned.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, tactician wise and in the information management role, your success and your contribution really depends on how well you understand everybody else's jobs and what everybody else needs to do their job, which I think I attribute my comfort level with to youth sailing. I think we've talked briefly about it, but growing up, I lived in a house next door to our yacht club, and it was super common for me to like get home from school, grab my life jacket, and then just walk around the docks and see if anybody needed crew. So I got really comfortable just
like jumping right
plugged in, playing, whatever kind of boat, whatever kind of position. I'm not going to say I did everything well, but I learned everything, and I learned to be really comfortable in those dynamic team environments. And I think being comfortable with like jumping into a situation, trying to figure out what everybody's roles are and what everybody else needs to be successful and how I can fit those or fill those needs, directly came from sailing.
Yeah, I'd agree. I could see it. So, man, I have so many things I want to hit with you on my list, but we're trying to keep it short so people pay attention. So I'm going to link, instead of talking about all of them, you've written some really interesting, thought-provoking articles. One is about disaster tourism. The other is a really cool piece about the Cajun Navy and your response in Hurricane Harvey. And if I can briefly summarize it, tell me if I'm wrong. You were there responding. You saw, that the Cajun Navy, you were fielding so many calls of people wanting to help. It wasn't just calls of people who needed you guys. There was all this community willing to help. Well, maybe you want to elaborate briefly on that. I thought that was really neat.
So a lot of that was really, so the Cajun Navy was my first exposure to kind of the world of what the emergency management field calls spontaneous civilian responders or unaffiliated responders. So the Cajun Navy were, some of them were trying to like plug into the official response, but then there were a bunch of people who were saying like, I have a truck, I have a boat, people need me. And they were going and doing things, which on one hand is awesome. People that have the local knowledge, people that have the specialized assets, you can't beat that. But there were examples of them kind of either doubling efforts or doing things that were just like wrong, like taking people from areas that were safe and evacuating them to areas that weren't safe. Or like there were a couple times where I got a call for, we're going to coordinate this rescue. We're going to pick up these people from the house. And then the helicopter gets there and there's nobody in the house because somebody in a truck had just picked them all up. So for in the moment, I was like, what's going on? Like there's all this waste. We're so inefficient because we don't know how to take advantage of all of these people who have the resources and the willingness to help us out. And yeah, I think that's a problem that we still really like haven't solved, of how to maximize, regular people who are going to help regardless of if they're asked to or not. So
what are the spontaneous responders? That's what it's called in your world.
Yeah.
So spontaneous responders, they're sailors, when you're doing all the search and rescue with the United States Coast Guard, sailors are likely going to be in situations to be spontaneous responders. What are some simple things with all your experience that we as average sailors or watermen or waterwomen, paddlers, surfers, we talked about the flipping, but what can we do if there's something going on, we hear something on, channel 16, what are some common mistakes that you've seen, or what are some simple plugs that we can all do better?
I think the first is communication of, people not knowing where to get authoritative information or knowing like who's calling the shots for a certain region. Not that emergency management and emergency coordination is always a well-oiled machine, but there is almost always somebody who's responsible for overseeing volunteers. And sometimes it's as simple as like, hey, you know, whoever this person is, this is what we are doing unless you tell us no. And sometimes like that is huge.
Because at least they're passing information.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then in examples where it's either unrealistic or not feasible to connect to the official response, people shouldn't take risks that they wouldn't normally like take. You don't want to get in over your head. I think a lot of people who want to do well, and it's not that they like want to be heroes, but they see that there are people who need something and then they get into trouble themselves, and now they've made the situation worse.
Right. It's like when we teach water safety up here in Chicago area to the elementary schools, we say stay or throw, but do not go.
Yeah.
For those little kids. But yeah, if one person needs rescuing, the last thing you want is to have to rescue two people.
100%. Yeah.
So Brad, oh man, there's so much more we could go over, but do you have any parting thoughts for our potential viewers? Share
them. Yeah. I think for emergency management and disaster response, I think everything is always changing, right? So like the coronavirus response is different than anything that we've really done. And with technology, with different personalities, with different bodies that people have to answer to, everything is always changing. So you can't just rely on experience. You have to spend some time, developing your understanding of the principles and how the game is played. And I think to be successful in search and rescue, emergency management, disaster response, you have to commit to being a student of the game. And that's an idea you become very comfortable with in sailing. It's a lifelong sport. And if you ever stop learning, you're probably going to stop developing in sailing. There's always something else you can improve on. And being able to take that trait, even outside of emergency management, search and rescue, like you can apply that to anything. I think sailors are really well suited to be lifelong learners and active learners, and that you can't beat that in really any field.
Brad, you nailed it. Very well spoken. Dude, thank you so much for all you're doing, keeping everybody safe. I'll thank you on behalf of all my sailors at least. Tell Marissa that I say hi and we'll catch up really soon. Yeah, Brad Milliken, Suits and Sailors, first bow tie we've had on, looking really good. Thank you, man.
Thanks, man.